the easiest doctrine of the Reformed faith to believe is total depravity.
I've spoken many times about the need to re-emphasize the role of supernatural evil in explaining the current situation that our world is in. And as Christians, I believe that we've downplayed and we have de-emphasized the role of the supernatural evil in explaining the world, because we've come through an age of modernity where the materialist worldview that was driven by the culture was, for the most part, embraced by the church as well. And so all of our discussion and all of the defense of why we believe that God is good, despite suffering and evil that is seen in the world, was all focused on the realm of the material. And one of the things that Christians would often say, though, is that it's not God's fault that bad things happen and that there is evil in this world, because we live in a fallen world. And in saying that it is a fallen world, they are, of course, referring to the fall of Genesis 3, the story where Adam and Eve partake of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, this story does have a supernatural element to it, because they are deceived by the serpent, who is recognized to be the character of Satan in the New Testament, or the devil, the accuser. And the only strategy that he employs in causing this evil is to lie. And it's not a wholesale lie, but it's a manipulated version of the true story. And ultimately, this is the role of supernatural evil in our world, to speak lies. But it takes a human to listen and to enact upon that lie. And so today I want to look a little bit more closely at that story and how it impacts us and what I think it means. Now, I'm coming at this from the perspective of the Calvinist concept of total depravity.
And again, I'm a Calvinist. Total depravity.
And as I can show from a little clip, this is something Paul VanderKlay mentions often.
It'll never happen. I'm a Calvinist. I believe in total depravity. And everybody's got their flaws. Again, I'm a Calvinist. Total depravity. Everybody in the world. I am a sinner. Embracing the doctrine of total depravity doesn't mean that somehow I'm no longer susceptible.
It's really a theological concept that is misrepresented by those who don't understand and appreciate it. And perhaps, it's been called a POS theology.
It's not like this deistic model where the grand watchmaker wound up the clock, created, and then they just go on their own. That's not how we exist. But I would posit that in order to have this piece of theology, that you have to assume that underneath it.
Because it seems to make the person be in this place of never being able to do anything right, and therefore, what's the point?
What we often talk about with total depravity versus original blessing. If humanity, if a man is ultimately totally depraved and bad at his core, whatever, Calvinist, I get all the caveats with common grace, like I get it, but that's just part of your whole house of cards. Just put that to the side for now. If you assume that a human being is totally depraved and wicked and bad at its core, well, what is that? How does it exist? Like, what is that thing that is totally bad? And how does it have existence? And how does that relate to the image of God? And
then you get into a lot of semantic arguments about only Christians can do good and people that aren't Christians can't do anything that's good. And even if they do something good, it's really bad because they weren't a Christian and so they weren't doing it for God. And This is a very bad understanding.
Then you sort of are fudging on your total depravity, because part of the total depravity is that you're never getting it right.
It's not what the scripture is portraying at all, because this all comes down to this story of Genesis 3.
Because we live in a fallen world. And if anybody would ask me what I think is maybe the greatest weakness of many, many Christians, is that they might fight like mad against the liberal theologian for the first 3 chapters of Genesis, including the fall, theologically. But I would just say, from my experience, most Christians don't live realistically in the light of the fall.
Now, a Reformed theologian would look and say, I see evidence of the fall everywhere I look. It's called total depravity.
As it begins, now the serpent was more crafty than any other beast of the field that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God actually say, 'You shall not eat any tree in the garden'?" And the woman said to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden. But God said, 'You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die.' But the serpent said to the woman, 'You will not surely die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.' So, when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths." Now, I have mentioned before that we can view this as the first instance of propaganda in the history of the world, because the devil did many things. He instilled doubt by saying, "Did God actually say?" And he changed the question from the accurate representation to a more fallacious version, a straw man, when he says, "You shall not eat of any tree in the garden." Well, the garden was where they lived. That's where all the trees were. And he knew that it wasn't the case. But he placed in the woman's mind the idea that perhaps what she thought she knew was something that could be doubted, and that it was something that she could be suspicious of. And in asserting her affirmation that God did not say they could not eat of any tree, but only the specific tree, she goes too far. She says God says, don't not even touch it. Well, that's not what God said. And then the serpent tells her that God doesn't want you to eat of this, because when you eat it, you will become like God, knowing good and evil. And when he says this, that is when the woman reassesses the situation and looks at the fruit and the tree and thinks about it and what it would be good for. And Adam is with her, and they both eat of it. And they both willingly take this. And many people have mistakenly thought that the sin is that they ate from the tree. That was not the sin. Eating from the tree was not wrong in and of itself, but it was because they disobeyed the order that God had given them. And some have thought that this is just a arbitrary test, that God had to put something in there so that they could have a free will decision, and thereby their love would be volitional because they had the option to reject it. And I don't think that's true either, because I think God did create this tree for good, and it was not yet the right time for them to eat the tree. But eventually they would have had the opportunity if they had been obedient. And this is fleshed out in C.S. Lewis' book Paralandra, where he kind of replays this whole scenario, but on a different planet. And of course, Adam, who was there, he didn't know about the difference between evil and good, but he knew about the difference between good and not good. Because God had Adam by himself working in the garden, naming the animals, seeing what they were good for as companions, and that none of them were suitable, and this was not good. So Adam experienced something that was not good. And God didn't need to discover this. This was for Adam to know. But after Adam understood what was not good, God created the woman and gave her to Adam. And then it was very good. And Adam knew the difference. He knew that if something was not as good as it should be, that in time God was a God who would give good things to his children. So he should have known better. But I think the key thing is the idea that the serpent puts forth this proposition that if you eat this, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God. And that was the sin, that the man and the woman thought about being like God, and they decided to reach out and grasp that. To contrast that we should have the same attitude toward one another that Christ Jesus had, who, though he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be grasped. So, Jesus, who was equal with God, did not see that equality as something to be grasped. But Adam and Eve did see that, and they did grasp. When they grasped the fruit, they were grasping for the idea of being equal with God. And the area that changed was in their bodies, and it was in their genes. And we now understand a concept of epigenetic change, that powerful influences outside of our body, our experience, the environment, the things that we partake in, and powerful events can alter a person's genetic makeup and change them in profound ways.
Sweet smell of fruit doesn't normally send rats running, but when researchers paired the orange, cherry, almondy scent of the chemical acetophenone with a painful electric shock, lab rats quickly learned to fear it. Along the way, extra neurons sprouted in their noses and in the smell processing center of their brains, making them super sensitive to the scent. This result isn't shocking. What is surprising is that the rats' pups and their pups' pups were also startled by the smell of acetophenone and had the same extra neurons as their fathers, despite never having been introduced to either their dads or the fruity scent before. But how could the pups have inherited something that their fathers learned? Basic genetics tells us that only DNA gets passed along to offspring. Characteristics like memories, scars, or giant muscles can't get passed on since acquiring them doesn't alter the genetic code. But it turns out that instilling fear in the rats did trigger genetic changes, not in the DNA sequence itself, but instead in how that code was read and used in the rats' bodies. In every cell, biological machinery constantly translates DNA into the proteins needed to carry out vital processes. Chemical switches attached to the DNA turn genes on or off or up and down, telling the machinery which proteins to produce and in what quantities. These switches, called epigenetic tags, are why a kidney cell looks and acts differently than a skin or nerve cell, even though all three cells have identical DNA. But the switches in any one cell aren't set in stone. Teaching those rats to fear the fruity smell switched one of their smell-sensing genes into overdrive. Researchers don't know all the places in the rats' bodies where this switch got flipped, but they know it happened in one key set of cells, the rats' sperm cells, which would one day pass along the tweaked genetic material, making the next generation of rats super sensitive to acetophenone.
And this is something that we know now. We know this, that women who experience trauma, their children are born with different effects and a different genetic makeup. Certain genes are turned off and others are turned on.
Rodents aren't the only creatures demonstrating this weird type of inheritance. In Överkalix, Sweden, boys who suffered through tough winter famines went on to have super healthy sons, with extremely low rates of heart disease and diabetes. And their sons had the same excellent health, living an unbelievable 32 years longer on average than the grandsons of boys who hadn't gone hungry.
I think that in eating this fruit, this thing that happened in the garden, there was several of these sort of epigenetic changes that happened. First, there was the effect of the fruit itself, which was to open their eyes and make them like God, knowing good and evil. And so, as human beings grow to a certain age, they begin to be aware of the differences between right and wrong, and they understand this, and we have conscience and awareness. But before that, before children are even aware of right and wrong, there's another thing that is baked into their genes, and it is the concept that equality with God is something to be grasped.
If you really listen, you can hear the difference, because a baby, angry baby, sounds different than a sad baby. But if you don't listen, the baby will have you thinking it's sad, no problem. Then you'll feel sorry for it and go, help it out. And really, it's just thinking up yours, So
when we look at the evidence that we've learned now from a psychological standpoint, children are not blank slates. They are born with a will. And it's not necessarily right to say that it is evil, but it is a misorder position in their hierarchy of being, of where they belong. And so a tiny baby thinks that they are a god.
it's so interesting, you can see marked signs of independence in children, well, right from the time they're born, basically, because what's one of the things that's really funny about infants is that, when they're crying, you always think, oh, the baby's, well, you're crying, the baby's sad. It's like, no, a lot of the time that baby is angry. And the way that we know that is because you could do facial expression coding on infants, just like on adults, and you can tell what emotion they're expressing. And very frequently, like when the kid starts to recognize his mom explicitly, because he or she knows the smell right away, pretty much in the sound of the voice, but visually, if someone who comes in and it isn't who the baby wants, so generally it isn't mom, the baby will start to cry. But it's not because the baby's sad, generally, it's because it's angry that mom didn't show up. And that's an early sign of will. It's like this kid wants things, and it's perfectly willing to tell you about that.
And a little 2-year-old thinks that they are a god, and a 4-year-old thinks that they are a god.
Because I was interested in looking at the early signs of problems with physical aggression. And when you start looking at young children, very young children, you become amazed to see how frequently they physically aggress each other. And they are much less sophisticated than elementary school children or adolescents or adults. So the action is really on into physical aggression. And as we measured the physical aggression in early childhood and developmentally over time, it became very obvious that what we were all thinking, that aggression increased with age and sort of peaked in adolescence, late adolescence, we showed that physical aggression was at its peak in terms of frequency around between age 2 and age 3. We were looking at in daycare centers, and I finally discovered that the place in the world where you're most at risk of being physically aggressed is in a daycare center when you're between age 2 and age 3. The amount of physical aggressions is incredible. Of course, they are not well coordinated and they are not very strong, so the damage is not the same damage as a physical fight when you look at adolescence, but the frequency of physical aggression is clearly there. And to a certain extent, it changed my way of looking at this problem of aggression throughout development, from very early childhood until adulthood.
Here we have an example that this will, this irrational belief that a baby can have, that it is the master of the universe, starts before they can even talk. But I think that the Bible actually speaks that it's earlier than that. Genesis 25:22, it talks about Isaac and Rebekah. Rebekah becomes pregnant with twins, with Jacob and Esau, and the children struggled together within her. And she said, "If it is thus, why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, "2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. One shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger."
I'm a Calvinist. I believe in total depravity. This world is not perfect.
A little 2-year-old thinks that they are a god, and a 4-year-old thinks that they are a god. And over time, they're disabused of that notion because reality teaches them otherwise. But they don't learn their proper place. Maybe they learn that they're not on the top of the hierarchy, but they don't quite learn what their role in the universe is. And this extends beyond childhood, because we all do the same thing. And this is the root of the sinful nature, and that is why man is totally depraved.
And total depravity. I know something about total depravity, and I know something about where this all goes because I've seen this stuff working itself out.
Now, it doesn't mean that all humans always will do the most wicked things they want to, because even in that moment when Adam and Eve made that choice, they had an idea of what it meant to become like God. And their example of God was mostly positive, because God had created the world, and God had given them a beautiful garden to live in and provided for all their needs. And even though he made Adam wait, and Adam experienced something that was not good before the woman was given to him, he even provided the woman, and that was very good. But they also added this idea that they got from believing the devil, that God would withhold something from them, that God was holding something back, that he was not allowing them to have something that they felt like maybe they should deserve. And so humans have a belief that they are meant to be a god, but what their idea of a god is a little bit off as well. But because it's mostly positive, humans can be very productive thinking that they are gods. And if they can put themselves in a position of being a benevolent and generous kind of person, that's good for them, for their ego, but it's also good for the people around them. And there will be peace. Now the problem is that when too many little gods all get together in the same place, they're going to have some disagreements about who gets to be in charge. And of course, that is why God splits people up at the Tower of Babel and at many other places in the Bible, and I believe throughout history as well. It's not good for sinful people who think that they are gods to live too close to other sinful people who think that they are gods, because then you're going to have a clash. And for their own development, sometimes God separates the children to keep them from hurting each other. So that I think is the basic premise of what the thought of the sinful person is to believe that equality with God is something to be grasped. Now, we also know that we live in a finely tuned universe.
From galaxies and stars, down to atoms and subatomic particles, the very structure of our universe is determined by these numbers. These are the fundamental constants and quantities of the universe. Scientists have come to the shocking realization that each of these numbers has been carefully dialed to an astonishingly precise value, a value that falls within an exceedingly narrow, life-permitting range. If any one of these numbers were altered by even a hair's breadth, no physical, interactive life of any kind could exist anywhere. There'd be no stars, no life, no planets, no chemistry.
This is something that we've discovered over time. But all of the parameters for existence of the world and the universe and everything, gravity and the speed of light and all of the properties of physics and the laws of all the forces that hold the universe together are all tuned so precisely that tiny little changes in any of them would cause catastrophic damage and would cause life to be impossible on our planet.
Consider gravity, for example. The force of gravity is determined by the gravitational constant. If this constant varied by just 1 in 10 to the 60th parts, none of us would exist. To understand how exceedingly narrow this life-permitting range is, imagine a dial divided into 10 to the 60th increments. To get a handle on how many tiny points on the dial this is, compare it to the number of cells in your body, or the number of seconds that have ticked by since time began. If the gravitational constant had been out of tune by just one of these infinitesimally small increments, the universe would either have expanded and thinned out so rapidly that no stars could form and life couldn't exist, or it would have collapsed back on itself with the same result: no stars, no planets, and no life. Or consider the expansion rate of the universe. This is driven by the cosmological constant. A change in its value by a mere 1 part in 10 to the 120th parts would cause the universe to expand too rapidly or too slowly. In either case, the universe would, again, be life-prohibiting. Or another example of fine-tuning. If the mass and energy of the early universe were not evenly distributed to an incomprehensible precision of 1 part in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd, the universe would be hostile to life of any kind. The fact is, our universe permits physical, interactive life only because these, and many other numbers, have been independently and exquisitely balanced on a razor's edge.
And so, if we think about that this universe is so finely tuned, and we are part of it, and then we think about the idea of sin. And for this, we go to the New Testament, and we have the word hamartia in Greek, which means to miss the mark. And that is what sin is. It's not necessarily bad things, that bad things are sins. Obviously they are. Murder is a sin. Stealing is a sin. Adultery is a sin. To not sin is to live in perfection, is to hit the mark. And the more finely tuned the universe becomes, the more precise we must be in hitting the mark. And that is why, of all people who've ever walked on this earth, only one was able to live a life perfectly, and that was Jesus Christ. Now, I don't say that people don't ever do right and don't do well, but to the degree which we are absolutely, certainly, perfectly hitting that mark, we probably never are perfectly. But if the mark is there, maybe we can't hit it with an arrow. Maybe we can't hit the bullseye. But if we whack it with a hammer, we'll hit the mark. We'll hit a lot of other stuff. We'll do some collateral damage. And so that is the position that I think that humans find themselves in. We are not perfect, and the things that we do in life are not perfect. But an omniscient God, knowing how intricately everything in this universe works together, would not allow a piece in this machine, not that I believe in a mechanistic universe, but on a metaphorical level, he would not let a piece that would cause total destruction to remain in operation. And so he knows to what extent a person can operate out of their originally intended purpose and not cause catastrophic damage. Now, there is a lot of damage in our world, and I believe that goes to the point of the more finely tuned the universe is, the more significant the ramifications of our mistakes would be. And so I think from a plausibility standpoint, the idea that the original humans thousands of years ago could make a choice that would carry on in its destructive behavior and the consequences to this day is not unlikely.
When it comes to total depravity, being a Calvinist, well, it's a lovely thing. Somehow,
what is the application of this? I think the idea is that we tend to dismiss this idea because it makes us feel bad. And that's understandable, because nobody likes to be told that everything that they do is flawed and nothing will ever be good enough and pleasing enough. And that's depressing. It makes, if you understand it in that way, it will cause you to be unmotivated. But I think that if we look at it another way, it's the ultimate freedom, because it's not up to us to do everything right. We try, but we are flawed creatures. We're totally depraved. And yet if we rely on an omniscient, omnipotent, loving God to direct our steps, and we try to hit that mark, and we let him guide us then there is hope. There's hope for us. And I think this is the reason why Calvinism at its best is a good thing in the lives of those who understand it, because it's not up to me to do anything good. If something good happens, it's because of God. If something bad happens, it's because I wasn't listening to God. I wasn't doing what God wanted me to. And obviously, when you explore these things to their most furthest logical conclusions, I don't know. Sometimes it gets confusing. Will always be debates. I think that ambiguity is built in to the Bible to keep us humble. The good example is the story of Pinocchio. Because Pinocchio rescues his father from the belly of the whale. But all of the skills that Pinocchio needed to rescue his father from the belly of the whale were the things that he learned on Pleasure Island. Smashing stuff, breaking stuff, lighting fires, figuring out that smoke will make you sick. If it makes you sick, it'll probably make a whale sick. If it makes you want to throw up, it might make a whale want to throw up. So he did not have any skills that we would say are intrinsically good, but God uses our destructive natures, our warped, problematic, aggressive, egotistical selves to do amazing things. And I think the thing is that while in and of ourselves we are totally depraved and we're never able to fully hit that bullseye in the finely tuned universe in which we live, that also means that in surrendering ourselves to God, we don't have to learn how to do the exact opposite. We just have to be moved ever so slightly into the right place, and then we'll hit that mark. Not because we're so great, but because He is. So that's the way I think about this, and I've been thinking about it for a while. And I think that the more we take it seriously, the more hope we have for the future. Because if it's just about us figuring out the answers and it's just about us becoming the people that are supposed to change the world, then we're going to end up on the wrong side of the totalitarian force. Because it was always with the idea of humans able to strive towards perfection that the worst, most grievous injuries to humanity were perpetrated. And the more we look at ourselves and realize our own sinfulness and the fact that we're always in that position of trying to look at equality with God as something to be grasped, then that is when we're going to be in the place where we can really do good things.
Now, by virtue of embracing total depravity, I somehow feel that my depravity is expiated.
Because now equality with God can be grasped. Because God became a man, and He became a man who led the example of not trying to climb a hierarchy, but to race to the bottom of the hierarchy and serve everybody as if they were greater than He was. And so, if that becomes the image of God that we are trying to emulate, it can become within our grasp. But then we will rejoice in our sufferings, and we'll count it a blessing when we're persecuted for his name. And that's what I think we need to do to change the world. We need to be willing to sacrifice ourselves as Christ did. And when people see Christians willing to surrender not only their physical lives, but their wealth, their status, the esteem of their peers, their respectability, when we put all of that on the line and say that we're sacrificing this to glorify God, that's when the world's going to change. That's when Christianity is going to have a new revival and a new reformation. So, but to do it, we need to be honest with ourselves. And if we cringe at the idea of somebody saying you're desperately wicked and unable to do anything good in and of your own self, then we're not there yet. Because we still want to have a little bit of that glory. And we should desire that only God gets the glory. And then that's when we'll change the world.